Welcome back everyone to the Organic Archery YouTube channel. Today's video is chapter 2 in the 6-part Art of Arrow Making series. And today I'm going to teach you how to make finely matched wooden arrows using split timber and a very old jig known as a shooting board. Now, I'm not going to pretend I know exactly when the shooting board was invented, but we do know it was in widespread use throughout the Middle Ages. Planing arrows by hand on a shooting board is my personal favorite method because you have a tremendous amount of control over the process and you can create very closely matched sets because you are extracting them from the same board stacked up right next to one another. With all the other methods in this series, there's a lot more variability in the materials. We talked about how with dowels, you can't even be certain that all the dowels are coming from the same tree or the same location. And with wild materials like river cane or bamboo or plum or hazel, dogwood, etc., you can get some finely matched sets, but it's a lot more work than if they are nested together in the same board. One of the ways split timber arrows were made historically was to cut down a tree and then buck the log to say 36 or 40 inches or whatever length you felt you needed to account for any checks that might happen during the drying process. And then you would split it out into bolts, which are pie-shaped wedges that look a lot like a bow stave or like a bow billet. And from there, you would take a froe or some other long blade and split those down into arrow blanks. The benefit of splitting your blanks out of a log with hand tools is that they'll follow the grain perfectly and you end up with arrows that have no run out. But the biggest con is the drying process because like bow staves, you would have to air dry bolts for 1 or 2 or maybe even more years depending on your environment. With a kiln dried board, so long as you have carefully selected the grain, you can process your arrow blanks immediately with power tools and turn them into arrows right away. Now, is splitting your blanks with power tools traditional in a purist sense? Definitely not. But remember, I'm trying to teach you guys how to build arrows fast and good. And when you do this for a living, there is value in doing things in a timely manner. I make a lot of bows and arrows, so it's been a journey for me over the years to try to figure out how I can keep the traditional ways alive, like planing and fine-tuning each one of these arrows by hand versus making my life a little easier with power tools. I don't personally feel the need to hand split each one of these square blanks, in early parts of the process when I have a table saw that can do it much quicker. You're gonna have to find out where that line is for you personally, but I have no shame in using power tools for the monotonous stuff and then switching to hand tools when the project requires care and finesse. Let's get into selecting the materials for split timber arrows. Okay, we'll start with this hastily drawn diagram to show you guys what you're looking for when you get to the hardware store. So flat, rift, and quarter sawn boards will all make perfectly good arrows so long as you're particular about the grain selection. So on the left side of the page here, I have drawn ideal examples of all three, and then we've got some so-sos in the middle and some boards you would avoid for arrow making on the right. So you can see with flat sawn, so long as that grain runs true all the way down the center of the board, you're good to go. Here's an example of a flat sawn board with long runouts. So maybe over the length of an entire arrow, there would only be 1 or 2 runouts. This is a board that will make serviceable arrows, although they won't be quite as durable as one with perfect grain, but this is one that you would take home. This is a flat sawn board with extreme grain runout, and I would avoid this at all costs. Moving on to rift sawn, you can see same as with quarter sawn, the grain kind of runs down the length of the board. Here's a perfect example for arrows where you would get maximum yield from this board because you could just rip it from left to right and all of these would be perfect. This is a rift sawn board with so-so grain. You can see that over a long distance, it's kind of running at a slant. You would be able to get arrows from, say, the center section here because you could plan it out, to make that grain run straight down the arrows, but you would have waste on this side and waste on this side. So there'd be some good arrows in here, but you wouldn't maximize your yield from this board. And here's a rift sawn with terrible grain run out, avoid at all costs. For quarter sawn, that's basically with the grain running straight up and down. Here's a perfect board, maximum yield. Again, here's one where the quarter sawn grain is kind of running at an angle so that maybe you get yield from the middle of the board but have a little waste on the side. But again, perfectly serviceable arrows so long as you're okay with missing out on some of the wood. And then over here is a quarter sawn board with extreme grain run out that you would avoid. Let's head to the hardware store and look at some real boards.
Many different wood species can be used to make arrows, and they all have their pros and cons. Today we'll be looking at poplar, aspen, and pine, but pretty much anything you have readily available in your area is worth a try so long as the grain runs perfectly straight down the length of the arrow. And of course, at the end of the day, the best arrow wood is the one you have access to. Just like in the dowels chapter, the most important part of the process is the grain orientation, and you have to be willing to walk away from the store empty-handed. These two poplar boards might look tempting, but they have too much run out for safe, durable arrows. This is a great piece of poplar, and it's 6 feet long, so you could cut it in half and get 2 pieces of arrow wood. And so long as you didn't mind a little waste on the far left side, you'd get some excellent arrows from it. Here's a piece of flat sawn aspen with really nice grain, and it's only got 1 run out over its entire length. Don't forget to check out some of the less common cuts in the store because these 2 poplar squares have nearly perfect grain. And be sure to avoid anything that's laminated. If it's glued together, it's not suitable for arrows. It doesn't matter if the board is flat, rift, or quarter sawn, so long as the grain runs straight. So the flat sawn piece in these shots is good for arrows, and the rift sawn piece is not quite good enough. When I try to imagine the arrow blanks cut from these 2 pieces of pine, there would be several runouts along their length, so I'm gonna pass. I know these examples are moving fast, so hopefully you're picking up on the pattern, but the one on the left in this shot is almost perfect, and the one on the right is a no-go. Today, I brought home a piece of flat sawn aspen and flat sawn pine with nice straight grain and minimal runouts.
Okay, so before I get all geared up and make a huge mess, I need to talk about a couple more things, and hang with me because it's important information. But the first is another major pro of the method, and that is the ability to create arrows from warbow arrows down to 5/16 kids arrows and everything in between. So long as your shooting board can accommodate, you can make the arrows any diameter or length you want. The second thing is, I started right after I got out of the Marine Corps in an apartment complex, and I had no way to store or run a table saw without driving everyone crazy. So I would go to lumber yards or lumber specialty stores and purchase the boards and ask them to rip it down into 3/8 square blanks for me. And you're gonna have to pay for that service. It's usually a small fee, but sometimes they charge per cut. And so it can add up, but if that's your only option, you make do with what you've got. From there, I got my own place and one of those really small job site table saws. I think it was like under 200 bucks for sure. And that worked well. I made several hundred arrows with that thing, but I was always sketched out by it because they're very loud and a little bit untrustworthy. They just aren't made to a high standard. It wasn't until just a few years ago that I found myself in an estate sale where they had this big cast iron table saw that had been completely unused for 500 bucks. But just know you have options. You know, you don't have to go out and spring for the big pro grade table saw. I've also cut many arrow blanks on my small band saw, which has the benefit of a smaller kerf and therefore less waste. But just get creative, guys. Part of making your own archery gear is solving problems. The third thing is table saw safety. And I am not a stickler for safety by any means, but I want to remind you to watch table saw safety videos if you are unfamiliar with the tool. They're very powerful machines and they command respect. And when you're ripping arrow blanks, the dimensions are very small, so you're close to the blade and there are things that could go wrong. So I'm not going to act like I'm some master safety instructor on the table saw, but I am very careful and very alert when I'm ripping arrow blanks. The final thing is some starting dimensions for you, depending on what diameter of arrow shaft you're going for. So I like to use millimeters, mostly just because the way this saw is set up, it's easier to read the millimeter marks here. But when you're first learning, I would encourage you to make the arrow blanks like 1 millimeter wider than you think you're gonna need, because there is a little bit of a learning curve with the shooting board, and we'll get into that shortly. But if you're getting a bunch of tear out over there and you're struggling to figure it out, you don't want a whole stack of blanks that are ripped really close to finished dimensions. If you leave that 1 millimeter of extra material on there, at least when you're first figuring it out, you're gonna have some room to adjust for any problems you run into on the shooting board. Every wood is different, so we can't possibly get into the weeds and talk about every wood species and every diameter and every spine. You're just gonna have to experiment. What might be wise if you're working a new wood for the first time is maybe rip yourself an 8, a 9, and a 10 millimeter blank and turn those on the shooting board and figure out which one, weighs and spines the best according to your intended use. Unfortunately, there's no way I could possibly tell you what diameter or wood species is gonna fly best out of your specific bow, so you're just gonna have to figure it out, and that's part of the fun.
I make my arrow blanks 36 inches long because that's the length of my shooting board, and my finished arrows are typically around 31 inches from the valley of the nock to the back of the point. But you can make your arrows as long as you want, so long as your shooting board can accommodate the extra length. And I'm starting with the aspen board here, which I know from experience is slightly lighter and more flexible than some of the other wood species, so I'm going to start with 10 millimeter blanks for this one. Most of my bows are between 60 and 70 pounds draw, so the finished arrow diameter of slightly larger than 3/8 will ensure that these are plenty stiff. But if you're shooting a lighter or a heavier bow than that, you just adjust the width of the blank up or down as needed. And I moved right into the pine board here, which tends to be slightly stiffer than aspen, so I'm going to go with 9 millimeter blanks for this one, which will give me a finished arrow diameter around 23/64. Most of your starting dimensions will come from experience and trial and error, but if you leave that 1 millimeter of extra material, you'll have plenty of room to fine tune later. Here they are ripped into 9 and 10 millimeter arrow blanks, and I got 10 from the aspen board and 11 from the pine board, so 21 blanks for less than $20. And there was very little waste.
All right, now that we have our square arrow blanks, we need to make them round. And that's where the real MVP of the process comes in, and the whole point of this video, and that is the shooting board. And I'll show you guys a close-up of the construction and talk about that shortly. But basically, it's used alongside a hand plane to accomplish three things. Make the square blanks round, make them uniform in diameter, and taper them on the ends if you wish. The tapering feature is more of a bonus and not really a necessity, but in some cases tapering the ends of the arrows can improve your arrow flight, or in specific historical replicas like arrows from medieval England, for example, the arrows would have been tapered from about 1/2 inch in the front to 3/8 in the back. Okay, onto the shooting board. It's a very simple jig. This is 2 pieces of 1x3 poplar, and you don't have to use poplar. You can use pine or oak or anything you've got access to, but you can either glue them or screw them together. I've got these glued and screwed, but right before you glue them together, you're gonna wanna make a V groove, and that's done using the same hand plane that we're gonna use to make the arrows. But I just make a little mark, 1/4 of an inch down and 1/4 of an inch in. And then I run that line all the way down the length of the board, and I cut it off flat with a plane. And then when you glue them together, you end up with a nice V groove that runs all the way down the length of the shooting board. Taking off these outer edges here, that's not really necessary, but I found that when you're really getting into it and you're working the arrows quickly and you know, trying to get a batch done, if your plane slips at all, it's going to contact those edges anyway. So I just chamfered those so that that's a non-issue. This one is 36 inches long, but feel free to make your shooting board as long as you want if you want some really long arrows. Lastly, there's an end cap right here, and it's just flush with the rest of the jig, but you can see it creates a little backstop right there so the blank can't slide out the end. And I've just got that glued and screwed as well. And then there are also a couple tick marks every 6 inches, and those are just little marks for me to use when making tapered arrow shafts. So the square blanks fit nicely into the groove. Backstop keeps them from sliding out, and you plane the top edge here. First taking the 4-sided blank down to 8 sides, then from 8 down to 16, and then just like in the dowel making video, we chuck them up in a drill and spin them real fast to make them perfectly round. The next thing you're going to want is something to size the arrows so they're nice and uniform. And I like to use this drill bit sizing guide. They're only a couple bucks. It's nice and compact. And this one goes from a 1/16 of an inch all the way up to a 1/2 in 1/64 inch increments. So I've got all the common arrow shaft sizes already right here close to one another. 5/16, 21/64, 11/32, 23/64, 3/8, on and on, all the way up to a 1/2. So this one's really handy. You don't necessarily need a sizing guide like this. You could just take a piece of scrap metal or scrap wood and use the drill bit that's the same diameter as your desired arrows and drill a couple sizing holes in a piece of scrap, and that works just fine. You're also going to want a hand plane or a thumb plane and the means and the skills to make these razor sharp. My 2 favorites are this vintage Stanley 102 and this vintage Stanley thumb plane. Both of these are very common and they're super easy to find online for just a few bucks. I don't know, paid 10 bucks for this one and 20 bucks for this one. The only thing is when you buy vintage, you will have to spend some time on the blade. A lot of times they have a little bit of pitting or maybe some improper sharpening. So I spend quite a bit of time flattening out the base of my planes and then putting a really nice edge on them. So regardless of which brand or style of plane you choose, you're gonna want to get that thing hair popping sharp to the best of your abilities. And it doesn't really matter how you get there. You guys know I'm an advocate for the freehand sharpening method, but one place I don't freehand sharpen is anything that requires a perfectly flat and square edge, like a plane or a chisel. And I've tried to freehand sharpen these over the years, but I always get dished edges. So I eventually moved on to those little jigs where you put them in place and they've got a wheel on the back and you just roll it back and forth on the whetstone or the diamond hone. And those work fine, but over time my edge would fall out of square and I'd have to spend a bunch of time truing it up. So that brings me to today's video sponsor, Advanced Machinery. And Advanced Machinery was kind enough to send me over one of the Tormek T8 whetstone sharpening systems. And this thing is the Cadillac of sharpeners.
The Tormek obviously falls into the category of luxury tools, and I've been eyeballing one of these for years. I just never got around to buying one, but I like to use what they call edge matching in the manual, which helps me get the same grind every time and quickly. The stone runs through a water reservoir, so you can do everything from establishing a grind to edge touch-ups without ever worrying about overheating your tools. I'm just running the standard jig that comes with the unit, and I think my favorite thing about this machine is how quiet it is. Loud machines drive me nuts. The stropping wheel and honing compound put a mirror edge on your blades. Look at that, perfectly ground and nasty sharp.
Now that I've got my plane razor sharp, I'm gonna put the first of the Aspen arrow blanks in the shooting board and plane it from 4 sides to 8 sides to 16 sides. One thing you want to keep an eye out for are grain tear-outs. You'll usually get 2 sides of the arrow to plane perfectly smooth from one direction, and then you've got to flip it over and plane it from the opposite direction to prevent tear-outs. If you continue in the direction that is getting tear-outs, they're going to go deep enough that you'll have those in the finished arrow, and that creates a weak spot. So I got my first 2 sides here, no problems at all, nice and smooth. And then on this side, I started to get some tear-outs. So I just flip it over and carry on with the last 2 sides. Now I have an 8-sided dowel. I'm going to go ahead and turn that into a 16-sided dowel. Now it's 16-sided and it's starting to look a lot more round. This one is ready for sizing. Typically, I'm just gonna take the whole stack and I'm gonna rough them out into 16-sided blanks. And then I'll start sizing the whole stack, but for the sake of demonstration, I'll run this one through. I'm just gonna find on my drill bit sizing guide here which one of these holes the arrow slides nicely through. And obviously, if you have an area that gets stuck, you might be a little inconsistent in your diameter, so you would just take a little wood off that area. But this arrow is fitting nicely through 13 30-seconds, which is just perfect. That's 2 sizes on this guide too large, or a 32nd of an inch too large. I want these Aspen arrows to finish out at 3/8 diameter. So with this being 2 sizes too big, By the time I sand out all the tool marks and make this perfectly round with the drill, it should slide nicely through the 3/8 sizing guide. Okay, so I roughed out 6 out of the 10 that I had because I almost forgot I need to save a few of those to make the thumbnail for this video when it's all said and done. So here are 6 16-sided arrow shaft blanks. They're still pretty rough looking from the planing process, and they're also very angular. So we need to make these nice and round and smooth. And if you don't have access to power tools or the means to acquire them, the manual way to accomplish this would be to use either a card scraper or a pocket knife and scrape them down until they're more round and closer to your desired finished diameter. The fastest way to do it would be to use a belt sander, but you also greatly increase your risk of taking off too much material and having these come in underspined if you use a belt sander. My preferred method is kind of the middle ground. It gives you good speed and control, and that's to chuck these up into a high-speed drill and spin them in some sandpaper, and from there I'll use the sizing guide to fine-tune them and make sure the diameter is uniform down the entire length.
Just like in the dowel chapter, I'm doing a little preliminary straightening so they don't have too much whip when I spin them in the drill. And then I run them through some 50 grit sandpaper and try to take an even amount of wood off the entire arrow.
Okay, I've got these nice and smooth and round and free of tear outs, and I've already got this one sized. So with my goal being 3/8, I'm gonna size the arrows on the drill until they fit through one guide hole larger than my desired finish diameter. So as long as I can get the arrow to slide effortlessly through the 25/64 hole with no snags, nice and smooth, I know that by the time I take all the spiral marks out and sand it with a finer grit, it'll slide right through the 3/8 hole, and it'll be the perfect diameter that I was aiming for. So I'm gonna go ahead and spend some time on the other 5, getting them sized, because you can see they start to fit through, but then they get hung up. So you take even amounts of wood removal off the entire arrow until the whole thing fits through the guide. You wouldn't want to do little spot treatments because it's very difficult to get a uniform diameter when you do that. So I'll continue to take even amounts of wood removal off until the whole thing goes through for the whole set. All right, so now that the entire set is just slightly oversized, I'm gonna run up and down the length of the arrow with my 50 grit sandpaper to get rid of all the deep spiral scratches from the sandpaper and the drill. And from there, I'm gonna cut the waste off the ends because you can see one side gets crushed by the drill and the other has a little bit of a natural taper to it. So I'll take about 1 inch off either end, make them all the same length, and that's my chance to weigh them to see if I need to take off any more material to get a weight matched set. All right, let's see what we get. I might have to tear this a bunch of times because it's really cold in here and this scale's pretty finicky when it's cold, so you might see the numbers jumping around, but we'll try to get an accurate reading. 466. 460, 462. 462. Looking good so far. 464. 462. All right, doesn't get much better than that. This just goes to prove one of the pros of this method that I spoke about in the beginning of the video. I didn't even have to do any extra sanding to these. I just sized them to 3/8, cut them all to the same length, and I've already got a half a dozen arrows that are weight matched to within 6 grains of one another. And that's not always gonna happen, especially when you're first learning to size the arrows, but there's a better chance of it happening with this method than any of the others in this series because the arrows are nested together in the same board. But if you're trying to make a closely matched set for extreme accuracy, I wouldn't settle for any more than about 20 grains variance. And I would probably try to get them closer to within 10 grains of each other. But in realistic hunting scenarios, you can have quite a bit of weight variance and still shoot accurately out to say 15, 20 yards. But by matching them a little bit more closely, you're pretty much just trying to eliminate one of the variables. All that's left to do to these is step down the sandpaper. So I'm gonna go down to 120 and then 220 to get a nice smooth arrow. And then I'm gonna carve the nocks and they'll be ready for sealer.
I'm using the exact same method I used on the dowels to carve these nocks, so if you want a detailed step-by-step tutorial, go back and watch chapter 1. Always remember, the most important thing about the nocks is cutting them perpendicular to the grain. I'm using the same set of tools I did in chapter 1, where you will also find a detailed tool breakdown. And again, the second most important thing is that the nocks are cut perfectly straight. I'll finish this one in silence.
The final step for these arrows to prepare them for fletching is to seal them to protect them from moisture. So I'm going to use tongue oil and I will apply it in the same way I did in chapter 1 with the dowels. So 1 coat a day for 3 days. But before I sign off on this video, I want to talk about spine and making tapered arrows. I know spine is going to come up in the comments, and I used to be really particular about it. I would weight match my arrows and then spine match them to within 5 pounds of each other. But over the years, I just found that for me personally, spine does not matter quite as much as weight matching. within reason, of course. If you have an arrow that's, say, 30 pounds over spine or something crazy, it's definitely going to struggle to flex around the bow. It'll make excessive noise and fly crazy. Or if you have arrows that are way too weak in spine, they might flex enough to break out right. But with a little bit of experience, you'll be able to tell that they're in the ballpark. If you flex these arrows and they feel like noodles, it's probably safe to say they're not safe for a hunting weight bow. Or if you're putting a bunch of pressure into them and you can barely get them to flex at all, they might be too heavy. By leaving them extra long from the get-go, in this case, these are 34 inches before points, that's going to give me all the room I need to tune them. As you shorten the arrows, they become stiffer in spine and vice versa. So I'll be able to match these to one of my bows, no problem at all. I already know they're perfectly weight matched. And if I need to tune them, it's done after the fact by trimming the arrows down. There's no doubt that if you want to be as accurate as possible and really optimize your gear to the highest level, you need weight and spine matched arrows. But for the big game that I hunt, I don't take shots outside of 20 yards, and I really prefer it to be inside of 15 yards. So at those distances, I don't really need to worry that much about the spine. If the arrows are making a bunch of noise or flying crazy, I'm gonna go back and do the extra work to tune them to that specific bow. But you'd be surprised how many times with just modest sized fletchings on your arrows, they fly great right out the gate. I don't usually taper my arrows unless I'm having arrow flight issues, or I will maybe barrel taper a set now and then just to mix things up, but I'm trying to stick to fast and good because, like I've mentioned before, they're expendable ammunition to me, and I don't want to go through the extra steps to taper them if they never needed it in the first place. All right, here are the tapering marks for the jig. These are set at 6-inch increments, so 6, 12, and 18 inches from the backstop. And you would taper them after you've already got the arrow pretty much sized and round and smooth. So here we have a 3/8 poplar dowel. It's already nice and round. We can pretend that it's the arrows that I just sized to 3/8 from scratch. And I'm gonna take my Stanley thumb plane that I leave set at a very fine cut so I can taper arrows. And I'll do my first pass at the 6-inch mark. And I'm just gonna roll the arrow around and take a pass off until I get all the way around. So I'm rolling the arrow as I go to try to take an even amount off. Now I've gone all the way around, so I'm going to move back to 12 inches and do the same. Notice how I'm going now from 12 all the way to the tip still. We want to taper the nock end of the arrow more. Okay, there's one full revolution at 12. Now I'm going to move back to 18 and go over the whole thing all the way to the nock. You can see the little marks that the plane leaves, so you know when you've made a full rotation. So now we have an arrow that's 3/8 at the point end, and around the middle of the shaft, it tapers down to what I'm hoping will be 11/32. And you can taper it as much or as little as you want. But I'm gonna go ahead and hit this with my 50, then 120, then 220. You can run this in the drill if you want to, but I don't think it's necessary. Little with the 50, little with the 120, little with the 220. Check it. Perfect. All I'm looking for is that the nock end fits through that 11/32 sizing guide. And now I know I have a 3/8 arrow that is tail tapered to 11/32. That's it for this video, guys. As you can see, the ancient shooting board always has been and always will be an excellent tool for shaping split timber arrows. You'll see this set of arrows again in chapter 5 when I choose a fletching style for them, and in chapter 6 when we put some points on them. Thanks for watching.